When you think of the American women's rights movement, these are probably the images that come to mind: women protesting and demanding equality. And while these images are not wrong, I now have a different image that comes to mind when I think about the women's suffrage movement.
The first rear chain-driven safety made its appearance in 1879. The saddle is now much further back, and there are thrilling footrests for coasting, my dear.
The bicycle was the spark that ignited a decades-long battle that ended in women finally getting the right to vote and the prohibition of alcohol. I first learned about this two-wheeled revolution after reading about a disease that was made up to deter women from riding bikes in the late 19th century. This is a story about how the bicycle shaped America.
Where there's a wheel, there's a way.
The origin of the bicycle is shrouded in mystery, confusion, and lacks a clear and credible source that identifies the first inventor. However, it is widely agreed upon that the first iterations of the bicycle were pretty lame and inefficient at traveling any sort of significant distance. And it was basically a scooter. There wasn't a chain, there were no gears, and it had no pedals. These early predecessors were called hobby horses, but not to be confused with what elite professional athletes ride for the modern day extreme sport of hobby horsing.
With technique and speed, the jury evaluates poise.
Kirkpatrick Macmillan, a Scottish man, came up with the idea of adding pedals to the hobby horse. He did this for the first time in 1839. These pedals were connected with rods that went from the pedal to the back wheel, and this would have made pedaling extremely difficult, but this did not stop him from making regular 14-mile bike rides. This would later inspire him to take on a 2-day, 68-mile trip from his hometown of Dumfriesshire to Glasgow. The potential for the pedal bicycle was realized and copied many times over. Macmillan and his invention gave the Scots bragging rights. That was up until a sketch of a bike was discovered inside of the Codex Atlanticus. The Codex Atlanticus is the longest single set of drawings and notes from Leonardo da Vinci. Inside of the book, there was a folded and glued up page. Legend has it this page was glued in the 16th century by a conservator of the work because the page was covered in phallic symbols. So obviously I did what anyone would do when you read this information. I sat down and I started to Google Da Vinci penis, penis bike, Da Vinci bike penis, and about 300 other combinations of these words. And just a disclaimer, searching these words provides a lot of varied results. As we all know, the internet is a weird and wild place. You can thank me later for doing the Lord's work. There does seem to be a lot of conflicting evidence around whether or not these symbols were actually meat rods drawn by Da Vinci, purple pneumatic drills drawn by students, or just random squiggles that looked nothing like spitting cobras. Pork whistle doodles aside, the Da Vinci bicycle sketch was proven to be a fake by Jacques Serret in 1976. While the origin of the bicycle is still a hot topic of conversation and is still debated today, there is zero confusion around who the founding father of American cycling is, a very crafty and persistent businessman who was so heavily invested in the bicycle that he had no choice but to make it succeed.
This is the Extraordinary of 1878, with ball bearings fitted to hubs and pedals rubber studded. The machine is front-wheel driven and safer to ride. The front wheel has a diameter 52 inches and the rear wheel 22 inches. And with the later Ordinary, life became just one mad whirl.
In the mid to late 19th century, cycling on public streets was outlawed because, among many other reasons, it frightened horses. This law would eventually change, largely due to the efforts of a crafty and dedicated businessman and the founder of Pope Cycling Company, Albert Pope. He engineered a massive marketing plan to introduce Americans to the joys of cycling. Pope imported the best cycling articles and pamphlets from England, and he had Charles E. Pratt, an American author, write a handbook called The American Bicycler. And together they gave away thousands of copies by 1879. Pope started a monthly magazine called The Wheelman, which was later called Outing. He gave prizes to doctors who wrote the most effective articles about health benefits of cycling for the magazine. In 1880, he and Charles Pratt formed the League of American Wheelmen, also known as the Law. The group were champion lobbyists for biking, they worked to overturn bans, they advocated for bicycle-friendly hotels and restaurants to help facilitate bicycle touring. The group was put to their first real test in 1881 when Samuel G. Huff was driving his horse-drawn carriage through Central Park in New York, when 3 cyclists came flying out of nowhere and they crashed into the carriage. The horses were frightened and took off running, except for the horse that was unfortunately killed when the buggy flipped over on top of it. Huff suffered a broken arm and finger in the accident, and the 3 riders were arrested on the scene. Albert Pope, after hearing about the incident, stepped in to finance the legal battles for the cyclists. If he and the Wheelmen could win this case, that would be huge for the cycling industry. but they did have an uphill battle, especially because the carriage driver was injured during the accident. Samuel Huff, the victim, had this to say in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I consider the bicycle to be the most dangerous thing, the life and property ever invented." In the end, the judge upheld the right of New York Parks commissioners to ban bicycles, and he fined each of them $5. Pope and the wheelmen were still determined and continued to fight for the right of American cyclists. They did this through their organization and magazines like Outing. The American public was being sold on this romanticized version of cycling that involved bicycle tours through the country with wind blowing in their hair, cycle-friendly hotels and restaurants, and a sense of adventure. However, there was still only a relatively small part of the population interested in riding bikes at the time because of the odd and hard-to-ride design of the high-wheelers, or also called the ordinary. But all of this changed in 1887 with the introduction of the safety bicycle, which has become the common design for all bikes that we see today. This design was called the safety bicycle for a very simple reason. It was much safer than their high-wheel predecessors. The ease of this model ushered in the bicycle boom, and the bicycle went from being an obscure and niche play toy that affluent to a common item of the everyday person. It seemed like everyone was riding bikes, even women, and this freaked a lot of people the F out. Prior to getting onto a bicycle, women had very little mobility. They very rarely left their house or their surrounding area unless they were taken somewhere on a carriage by a man. Women of this era were also being held captive by their literal clothes that weighed up to 25 pounds. All of this started to change when women started to ride bikes because it was an impracticality to have 25 pounds of garments when you're trying to cycle. So women started adapting their attire so that way it would make more sense for cycling, and this challenged the very fundamental of what was called the Victorian angel of the home, and people didn't like it.
Some people sigh for the good old days, but I prefer the new machines. You haven't so far to fall.
And perhaps one of the more notable women in history to straddle a seat on a safety is Frances Willard. After riding a bike for the first time, she was inspired by the endless possibilities provided to women.
The bicycle offered them a way of freedom.
How do you ride it? With great courage and dexterity, of which you are very capable.
And how do you pedal wearing such cumbersome things?
Carefully.
I imagine this started a massive cultural shift that was like so dense you could almost feel it in the air when women went from wearing such heavy clothes and walking around to putting on a lighter outfit and going for a bike ride.
Go home to your husband.
This change in appearance did not sit well with many conservative types, which is not a surprise. The degree of concern that people had when women started changing their clothes and riding bikes is pretty obvious when you start looking through the many political cartoons that depict scenes where women are dressed for bicycle rides and they're heading out the door, abandoning their husbands and leaving them wondering, where'd the wife go? Men were often depicted in these cartoons as frustrated and overwhelmed at the idea of being left alone to handle the responsibilities of the home. One of my favorite cartoons is this one that I found from a magazine called Puck, where the bicycle is kind of like peeking out from behind the chair in this like ominous manner, like, I'm gonna mess things up. But no amount of cartoons, name calling, or backlash could put the genie back into the bottle. The bicycle was literally shaping the culture of women and laying down the foundation for what would become the women's rights movement. Frances Willard would eventually go on to spearhead the women's suffrage movement and the temperance movement as well.
Just a fun little side note that's probably not too surprising. Frances Willard was kind of a racist. And I don't know if it was on purpose or she was just a prisoner of the ideology of the time, but when she was advocating for women to get the right to vote, she was only advocating for educated women to be able to vote, and this largely affected the black population. If it weren't for Ida B. Wells, only white affluent women would be allowed to vote, and that would kind of suck. Back to the video.
Female cyclists were shaking things up so much so that a 19th century anti-feminist and eugenist named Arabella Keneally wrote an entire book warning about feminism, and it was called Feminism and Sex Extinction. In the book, she focused on what she perceived to be the dangers of the women's rights movement. If she were alive today, she would most definitely be an anchor on a Daily Wire show. Among Arabella's many concerns, one of them was that if men danced too much, it would ruin their lives. She also warned women that while they should be exercising, they shouldn't do it too much because it would ruin their bodies and their natural abilities to be mothers of men. Keneally was not the only public figure at the time waving the red flag. Before the bicycle could really help women pedal their way to freedom, there was one more obstacle in the way. In an 1895 issue of the magazine New York World, a list was published by an author of unknown gender. This list was 41 don'ts for female cyclists. Among this list of ridiculous rules was one that said, "Do not cultivate a bicycle face." That was because Arthur Shadwell, a British physician and author, who was also a colleague of Arabella Keneally, had growing concerns about a disease that affected only female cyclists. This disease was aptly called bicycle face. Shadwell was a fierce anti-cyclist, and he was the leading expert at the time of this disease. Shadwell, however, was a bit of an absolutist in the sense that he thought women should completely avoid the bicycle, while Keneally thought women could ride, but only in moderation. And she even proposed a possible remedy for bicycle face, and that was to wear a skirt while riding.
And just like all of the fads and cultural movements of today, eventually society moved on from bicycle face and had other concerns. Funnily enough, the thing that came after bicycle face was horseless carriage face, because people didn't like it that women were driving cars. But anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for hanging out. I hope to keep making dives into history and to do videos like this. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for being here. Love your face.